Stop! I'll buy that Chinese woman.
The giant mountain said. Minutes later, she called him husband. He stood taller than any man she'd seen, face marked by sorrow, voice heavy as thunder. With one sentence, he changed her fate. She'd been for sale. Now she was safe. But why would a man feared by the town, who hadn't spoken a kind word in 10 years, risk everything for a woman he'd never met? Was it pity, guilt, or something buried deeper? And what did she see in him that made her call him husband before the sun had set? Let me tell you the truth. When chains break and silence speaks louder than guns, one question remains. Who truly rescued who that day? And what does it mean to be free? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded that stories like this still matter. If you believe in dignity, redemption, and standing up for what's right, then you belong here. Tell me which state you're watching from, hit that like button, and subscribe so we can keep bringing you more powerful stories from the heart of the frontier. The sun hung low over Bitterroot Crossing, casting long, jagged shadows across the dirt-streaked main street. Dust rose like smoke with every bootstep, and the air reeked of sweat, whiskey, and something fouler, desperation. A crowd had gathered in the square outside the saloon, where a makeshift platform had been raised. On it stood a girl no older than 20, her wrists bound with iron cuffs, her eyes wide with silent terror. Her name was Maylene, though no one had bothered to ask. To them, she was cargo, exotic, foreign, and priced by the pound. Men shouted crude remarks, their laughter barking through the air like gunfire. Most were railroad men, their skin darkened by soot and years of labor, their morals blackened further still. Others were miners, driven mad by gold dust and loneliness. Maylin flinched at every holler, her thin frame shaking beneath the torn linen dress clinging to her like a second skin. Her feet were bare, blistered from weeks of travel. Her lips, cracked and bloodless, whispered silent prayers in a language no one there would understand. Bledsoe, the man who called himself her owner, grinned from ear to ear. His teeth were yellow, his beard thick with crumbs and tobacco. A silver pocket watch swung from his vest, catching the light with every movement, a gaudy token of the money he made breaking backs and souls for the railroad. He held a whip in one hand and a deed in the other, one for pain, the other for proof. "She's strong," he bellowed. "Don't let that size fool you. She's wiry, clean, speaks just enough English to take orders. 5-year contract, signed and sealed. Who will start the bidding at $20? Voices rose like a wave. 20, 25, 30. Someone offered a gold nugget. Another shouted something filthy. Maylene's knees buckled. No one noticed or cared. Then the murmurs began. A shadow had appeared at the edge of the crowd. A giant of a man, tall as the door to the church, wide as the ox cart beside him, stood silent. He wore a long duster coat, frayed at the hem and dusted in pine needles. A wide-brimmed hat shaded most of his face, but his beard was gray, and a deep scar ran down his right cheek like a bolt of lightning frozen in skin. The townsfolk didn't need to see his face to know him. Elijah Stone, the mountain man, the widow-maker, the ghost who hadn't been seen down from the ridge in over a decade. Bledsoe narrowed his eyes. "You got business here, old man?" Elijah stepped forward. His boots thudded heavy against the packed earth. He looked once at Maylin, just once. Then his voice cracked through the square like a falling tree. "Stop," he said. "I'll buy that Chinese woman." Silence fell like snow. Bledsoe scoffed. "You ain't got no use for a girl like this." Elijah reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. It hit the platform with a dull thunk. When Bledsoe opened it, his face changed. Gold, raw and gleaming. Enough to shut every mouth on that street. No refunds, Bledsoe muttered. Elijah didn't answer. He turned, motioned once to Mei Lin. She hesitated, trembling, then stepped down. As they disappeared into the edge of the pines, a woman gasped from the crowd. She took his hand, and someone else whispered, she called him husband. The gold weighed heavy in Bledsoe's hand, more than he'd seen in months. For a moment, the cruelty in his eyes gave way to greed, his mind already counting what he'd buy, what he'd drink, who he'd brag to. Double the price, he spat, testing the stranger's resolve. She ain't just pretty, she's rare, foreign. That kind costs extra. The crowd shifted. Whispers crackled through them like dry leaves underfoot. But the giant didn't blink. Elijah Stone opened the pouch wider and poured another measure of gold into Bledsoe's hand. Nuggets, unrefined and honest, fresh from a mountain no man dared claim. Bledsoe's mouth twitched. He nodded. She's yours, then. But Elijah didn't take her hand. He didn't touch her at all. He simply turned and began to walk, his boots carving steady prints into the dry, cracked earth of Bitterroot's main street. No glance back, no word spoken, just a single nod that meant, follow or don't. I'm not making you. Behind them, the town watched in silence, shame prickling like sunburn on their necks. Mei Lin stood frozen. Her wrists, still red from the iron cuffs, trembled as she looked at the road he walked. She didn't know his name. She didn't know if she had just been saved or sold again. But the eyes in the crowd felt like claws, so she stepped forward, then again and again. Shoeless feet padding after him, she left behind the stench of men and whiskey, of glares and laughter that bit like dogs. With each step away from the square, her breath came a little easier, though the knot in her stomach remained. She didn't dare ask where they were going. She didn't speak at all, and neither did he. The trail out of town curled quickly into forest, the trees rising like silent judges on either side. Elijah walked with the pace of a man who knew the land's breath, its pulse and rhythm. Mei Lin followed as best she could, stumbling now and then on roots or loose stone. Once, she slipped on a steep incline and gasped. He stopped but didn't turn. He waited. Only when she caught up again did he start walking once more. By the time the sun fell behind the ridge, the path had disappeared into brush and frost. The town was long out of sight, swallowed by pines and shadow. Owls hooted far above. Mei Lin's legs burned with fatigue, her thin dress offering little warmth. Yet still he walked, the weight of silence growing heavier with every mile. At last, just as twilight turned the world to blue, he came to a halt beside a narrow stream. There, half hidden in the trees, stood a cabin, timber-walled and stone-rooted, smoke curling from the chimney in soft wisps. The windows glowed faintly with firelight. It was not grand, but it was alive. Elijah opened the door without a word. The warmth inside hit Mei Lin like a tide. Smoke, stew, pine wood, and something clean. He stepped aside, leaving the doorway open. She stood on the threshold, afraid to cross it, afraid not to. Her voice, brittle from disuse, came out in a whisper. "Why, me?" Elijah didn't look at her. He poured water into a pot and placed it over the hearth. "Didn't like the way they looked at you," he said at last, voice rough as gravel. "Didn't like the way they priced you." He nodded to the fire. "You'll sleep there. No one touches you here, not even me." Then he sat in a chair carved from a single stump, facing the flames, and said nothing more. Outside, the forest creaked. Inside, Mei Lin sat slowly by the hearth, folding her legs beneath her. She listened to the crackle of burning wood and wondered if the stranger who didn't touch her was a different kind of danger, or the first mercy she'd ever known. The cabin sat on a ledge just shy of the clouds, cradled by tall pines that whispered with every wind gust. The climb had been steep, unforgiving, and silent. Mei Lin's feet throbbed, her breath shallow from the cold. But the sight of the cabin gave her pause. It wasn't grand. It was worn from weather, with moss at its seams and time carved into its beams. But it stood solid, like it had never bent to storm or stranger. Smoke from the chimney spiraled into the pale dusk, and the door creaked as Elijah Stone pushed it open. The warmth inside was startling. Firelight danced across wood plank walls, casting golden light onto a narrow cot, a heavy table, and shelves lined with jars of dried herbs, pelts, and tools. It smelled of pine sap, stew, and something faintly sweet, perhaps dried apples or the cedar lining the hearth. Mei Lin stepped inside carefully, her hands tucked against her chest, ready to flinch at any sudden movement. But Elijah only nodded toward the fire. Then he knelt, ladled stew from a black pot, and placed a wooden bowl gently on the table without a word. She stood still, unsure. He reached over and set a thick woolen blanket on the chair nearest the fire. "Eat," he said, voice like stone breaking after a long winter. "Rest. Tomorrow you decide." She blinked. Decide? He finally looked at her then. His eyes weren't cruel. Worn, yes. Wounded, but not cruel. "You can stay," he said, "or leave. There's a trail back to the main road. I won't follow." Mei Lin nodded once, barely believing. She crept toward the fire, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. The heat soaked through her bones. Every inch of her ached, shoulders from fear, legs from walking, heart from too many promises broken. She took the stew. It was hot, thick with rabbit and root vegetables, seasoned with wild thyme. She ate slowly, watching him from the corner of her eye. He didn't stare. He didn't speak. He just sat near the back wall, whittling wood with slow, steady strokes. The only sounds were fire crackling and blade against bark. "Your name?" she asked after a long while. "Elijah Stone," he answered. She whispered her own. "Mei Lin." He nodded. That was all. When she finished eating, she rinsed the bowl in a bucket near the door. He watched but said nothing. She laid her head against the blanket and drifted to sleep, curled in the warmth of the fire's edge. In the dark hours before dawn, she woke once. Elijah was still in his chair, unmoving. His eyes were closed, but the knife rested loosely in his hand, and the whittled shape, half a bird, half a memory, lay on the table beside him. No threats, no chains. Just a quiet place above the world, guarded by a man made of silence and sorrow. Mei Lin stared at the flame until her eyes closed again. Whatever this place was, it was not hell. And whatever Elijah Stone was, he had not touched her. She wasn't safe yet, but she wasn't afraid either. The wind howled down the mountains like a wounded beast, rattling the shutters and frosting the corners of the windows in white lace. Days passed in a hush, broken only by footsteps, the creak of wood, and the low groan of the pines outside. The silence between Elijah and Mei Lin stretched long and uneasy, like a rope pulled taut, but never snapping. He spoke only when necessary, short, clipped words about firewood, food, or snow coming. She answered in nods or soft yeses, her voice barely more than breath. Elijah rose before the sun. He chopped wood, checked traps, and disappeared into the forest with a long rifle slung over his shoulder. Sometimes he returned with rabbits or a brace of grouse, sometimes nothing at all, always silent, always watchful. When he came back, he'd skin and clean his catch at the block near the shed, his hands steady, his face unreadable. Mei Lin remained close to the hearth, watching the shadows shift on the floorboards as she worked. She found things to fix: torn blankets, worn shirts, a sock unraveling at the toe. Her stitches were small, neat, practiced. In town, they'd called her quick-fingered for her sewing, even if they never let her speak. Now, she let the needle do the talking. At first, she didn't sing. She was too afraid. But one morning, with the sun pushing gold through the cabin window and the smell of pine needles warming on the hearth, she hummed a tune from home. A children's song, light, simple, filled with water and stars and peach blossoms. Her voice faltered at first, then grew steadier as the melody wound through the room. Elijah paused outside the door. He didn't step in. He just stood there listening, eyes closed, as if remembering something from long ago. When he did come inside, he didn't mention the song. He only nodded once and placed a rabbit on the table. The nights were the hardest. The silence then became heavy, pressing. Mei Lin would curl up by the fire, blanket drawn tight, eyes flickering with memories she couldn't forget, hands grabbing her, voices barking orders, cold rooms and colder men. But when she woke sweating from those dreams, she always found Elijah sitting in that same chair near the door, rifle across his lap, eyes open but far away. He never touched her, never came close, but he was always there. One afternoon, as she was hanging laundry on a makeshift line strung across the back porch, she caught sight of him standing at the edge of the tree line. He wasn't watching her. He was watching the ridge beyond, a place the sun never quite reached. His face was still, but his jaw was tight. She wondered then if he had ghosts too. Later that evening, she left a folded shirt on his chair, patched and mended, the hole near the sleeve repaired. He didn't say thank you. He just wore it the next day. And that was how it was. Silent days, cold nights, a slow rhythm building not from words, but from small things, shared space, mended cloth, and songs carried on the wind. She didn't trust him, not yet, but she no longer flinched when his boots crossed the floor, and he, who had once forgotten the sound of human song, now found himself listening for it each morning. The snow began to break in mid-April, not with sudden warmth, but with slow surrender. Icicles thinned and wept. The pines shed their white coats in clumps, and the stream behind the cabin began to sing again, gurgling over rock and root with a voice more cheerful than any words spoken in the house. Mei Lin stood at the edge of the thaw, her shoes still wrapped in cloth, her hands tucked beneath her sleeves, and watched the earth breathe again. For weeks she had remained inside the cabin, warming water, mending seams, grinding herbs, sweeping ash from the hearth. But now the world outside called to her, soft and steady. One afternoon she wandered down the slope beside the cabin and found a patch of soil where the snow had melted first. It was small, maybe 6 feet across, boxed in by the shadow of the east-facing slope. But the dirt was rich, black, and waiting. She knelt, pressing her fingers into it. That night, she sorted seeds from the small bag she'd brought from her old life, a secret she'd kept wrapped in silk inside her rolled-up blanket. They were dry but still strong: beans, bitter melon, Chinese chives, and long squash. She didn't ask for permission. She only rose early the next morning and began to dig. Elijah watched from the porch, leaning against a post as he chewed the end of a twig. He said nothing. He didn't offer to help. But the next day she found the rusted head of a hoe placed neatly beside the soil, its handle freshly carved and sanded. She nodded toward him when she saw it. He didn't return the gesture, but the corner of his mouth twitched. Each day she worked a little more, turning soil, planting careful rows, creating channels for water. Elijah busied himself nearby, mending the fence that circled the clearing, retying loose joints, hammering in new slats. He moved slowly, as if he didn't want to startle her, but he was always close enough to notice when she lost her balance, or when the wind caught her shawl. They still didn't speak much, but something had shifted between them, something softer. She began to leave extra stew in the pot, and he began to stack her firewood in a perfect line outside the door. At dusk, they sometimes sat by the fire and listened to the wind without filling it with words. Then one morning, Maylene stepped outside and found something on the stool beside her garden plot. A small wooden rabbit, no bigger than her palm, carved with fine, careful strokes. The grain of the wood curved around its body like fur. Its ears were alert, its posture proud. No name, no note, just the rabbit, waiting. She picked it up gently and turned toward the cabin. Elijah was splitting wood nearby. He didn't look at her, but he paused mid-swing. She said nothing, only cradled the rabbit in her hand like something sacred. That night, she placed it on the shelf above the fire, next to the dried herbs. And when she sang the next morning, her voice carried farther, not for him, but knowing he would hear. He didn't speak, but his hands, when carving the next piece of wood, moved with a little more care. The garden grew in quiet rows. So did something else, unnamed, unspoken, but planted deep. The storm rolled in without warning, thunder low and distant like the rumble of hooves, growing louder as gray clouds swallowed the sky. By midday, rain pounded the roof in sheets, and wind howled through the gaps in the walls. Maylene sealed the windows as Elijah hauled in wood. His coat soaked, boots leaving muddy tracks across the floor. He said nothing when he entered, only nodded once before setting the axe beside the hearth and tending the fire until it roared bright and angry. The storm trapped them for hours, then for a day. The cabin darkened under the weight of cloud and rain, and the sound of nature in unrest filled every silence. Elijah carved in the corner, the scrape of his knife steady as a heartbeat. Maylene kept to her side, folding linens, stirring the stew, humming now and then, more out of habit than comfort. But the storm pressed close, and restlessness crept in like cold through the floorboards. By the second morning, with the wind still howling outside, she noticed the ladder tucked behind a hanging coat. It led to a hatch in the ceiling, a narrow passage to the attic. Elijah had never spoken of it, never gone near it. Curiosity tugged at her. When he stepped outside to check the storm barrel, she climbed. The attic was cramped, with a low, slanted roof and dust thick as wool on every beam. Light leaked in from a small window, pale and uncertain. Old trunks and boxes sat lined along the wall like sentinels. She moved slowly, every creak of the floor loud in the stillness. Then she saw the chest. It was made of dark wood. The latch rusted but not locked. She knelt and opened it. Inside were a pair of tiny leather shoes, barely worn, the soles still soft. Folded beside them was a blue shawl, hand-stitched, the edge frayed where fingers had once clutched it tight. And resting on top, wrapped in a yellowed scrap of cloth, was a child's drawing. A house with smoke curling from the chimney. A tall man, a small girl, and a woman with long dark hair. The lines were crude, the colors faded, but love lingered in every stroke. Maylin's breath caught. She touched the shawl with reverence, heart aching with a sorrow she didn't understand. Then she heard the floor creak. She turned. Elijah stood at the top of the ladder, water still dripping from his coat, face pale beneath his beard, his eyes locked on the chest. "Put it back." His voice wasn't angry. It was hollow, broken in the middle like a fallen tree. She froze, then gently folded the shawl and laid the drawing atop it, closing the lid without a word. He didn't move, just stood there, staring at the chest as though it might speak. That night, he didn't eat. He sat by the fire with the carving knife idle in his lap, staring into the flames like they held a truth he couldn't reach. Mei Lin said nothing. She placed his bowl near the hearth and returned to her corner. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, silence thickened again. But now it wasn't the silence of strangers. It was the silence of ghosts and of two people carrying them. The morning after the storm, the world outside lay quiet and washed clean. Trees dripped softly, and the light that filtered through the cabin window was silver and still. Mei Lin stirred the pot of oats in silence, the spoon clinking gently against the sides. She didn't glance at Elijah, who sat at the table as he always did, hands clasped, gaze fixed on nothing. She placed a bowl in front of him. He nodded once. They ate without speaking, the fire crackling low in the hearth, the memory of the attic chest still hanging between them like smoke that refused to rise. Then, without lifting his head, Elijah spoke. "Her name was Ruth," he said, voice dry, almost brittle. "My wife, and our daughter was Lily." Mei Lin stopped moving. The spoon slipped from her hand and sank into the pot. "She was 5, he continued. Loved to sing. Her voice was high, bright, like a bird just woken. Ruth'd spin her around the room when the snow came down. We didn't have much, but we were warm. We were whole." He paused, chewing slow, like he needed the rhythm to steady himself. "One winter I was gone 3 days, he said. Had to help a neighbor with a sick horse, further down the valley. Snowed bad on the second night. When I came back, the house was smoke and ash. Stovepipe cracked. Fire caught when they were sleeping. No one saw it until it was too late." Mei Lin covered her mouth with one hand, eyes wide, lips trembling. "I dug through the ash with my bare hands," he said. "Didn't stop until they pulled me off. My arms were raw, bleeding. I didn't care. I thought, if I just find something. But there was nothing left. Not even a shoe." His hands clenched. The scars on his knuckles turned white. "Town blamed me, said I shouldn't have left them, that I was careless, irresponsible, that a man who lets his family die don't deserve a place among good folk." He looked up then. His eyes were dry but hollow, like the tears had burned away years ago. "So I left, took what I could carry, came up here where no one looked at me, where the wind didn't speak my name." The cabin was so quiet Mei Lin could hear her own heartbeat. She rose slowly, moved to the table, and sat across from him. Her face was pale, her eyes shining. "My mother," she whispered, her voice cracking. "She died on the journey. Locked in a freight car. No food, no air. I held her hand until it went cold. Her hands, small and scarred, clenched together on the table. I was sold 3 times after that." Elijah didn't speak. He just looked at her. Tears fell from her eyes, quiet and constant. She didn't wipe them away. "I used to think I'd never feel warm again," she said. "Not in my body, not in my soul." The fire popped. Outside, a bird sang once, then fell silent. They sat there, 2 people broken by flame and loss, no longer strangers. The silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was the kind that grows roots, that listens, that waits for healing to begin. Elijah reached across the table and placed one calloused hand over hers. She didn't flinch. Spring pushed deeper into the mountain, and the days stretched a little longer. Snow melted in rivulets down the rocks, and birds returned, timid at first, then louder, bolder. Inside the cabin, the air changed too, not with words, but with comfort. The silence between Mei Lin and Elijah no longer held tension. It had become a quiet understanding, a shared breath between two people who had learned to listen with more than ears. One morning, Mei Lin boiled water and set out a pouch of dried jasmine petals, wrapped carefully in cloth and tied with red string. Elijah watched as she moved with slow precision, pouring, steeping, then pouring again. The scent filled the room, floral and soft. She slid a cup across the table to him. "Jasmine tea," she said, "for calm." He lifted the cup to his lips, sniffed, then sipped. His brow furrowed. "Smells like flowers," he muttered. "Is flowers," she said. She expected him to push it aside. Instead, he drank it slowly, eyes fixed on the window. Next morning he brought her a snare, laid it out on the table beside the tea. "Come," he said, "you'll learn." They walked into the forest, where the trail curved along a creek. He showed her how to spot tracks, where the rabbits like to dig, how to place a snare without leaving a scent. His words were few, but his hands were careful, patient. She followed every movement. That evening she set her first trap alone. By morning, a squirrel waited in it, limp but cleanly caught. She buried it. She wasn't ready, but Elijah nodded with respect, said nothing more. On the third day, he asked her to pour the tea. On the fourth, she asked to try the trap again. One night, after a supper of venison stew, she told him about the jasmine bush behind her childhood home. How her mother would boil petals during the new year, how laughter always came with the tea. She poured a cup for each of them. "You think I forgot how to laugh," she said gently. Elijah said nothing. Then, as he lifted his cup and tried to mimic the sound she made when sipping, something about his pursed lips and overly serious expression made her laugh. Not politely, not softly, but a full, surprised laugh that echoed through the rafters like spring birds returning to a long, empty tree. He looked at her, startled at first. Then the corner of his mouth lifted. Not a smile. Not yet. But close. Later that week, a trader named Collins rode up the trail. He came twice a year to barter jerky and bullets for furs. Elijah stepped outside to meet him, but Collins's eyes caught on the movement inside the cabin. Mei Lin folding laundry by the fire, humming under her breath. "Well, I'll be," Collins muttered. "You got company now?" Elijah said nothing, just traded for salt and flour and waved him on. Collins left with his goods and his curiosity, and by the time he reached town, he'd already told 3 folks what he'd seen. "Mountain man's got a woman up there," he said, voice low, eyes wide. "Chinese, I think. Pretty thing. Laughing like a bell." And just like that, the rumors began again. Not cruel, but curious. A whisper that something had changed on the mountain. Something that looked a lot like home. The wind that carried whispers down the mountain didn't stop at tree lines or cabin doors. It traveled, curling into town like smoke, into saloons and dry goods stores, where men leaned over counters and spoke in low, eager tones. "She's still up there," one said, "living with him, like a wife." The words spread quickly, some laced with curiosity, others with the sharp sting of old prejudice. By the time they reached Bledsoe's ears, they were twisted, bitter, and burning. He sat in the back of the saloon, nursing a glass of rye and sour temper. The name Elijah Stone struck him like a blow to pride. His fingers tightened around the glass. The image of Mei Lin, free and warm in another man's home, his property, bought and paid for, set his jaw clenched. "That China woman was under contract," he growled to no one in particular. 5 years, signed it myself. Ain't no man, not even that scar-faced brute, got the right to take her. He slammed the drink down, stood, and strode out into the fading light. By sundown, he had returned with a rolled sheet of paper, yellowed and stamped with a crooked seal. It wasn't law, not really, but close enough for men like Bledsoe to use as a whip. He showed it to the sheriff the next morning, pushing it across the desk like it was gold. "She's mine," Bledsoe said. "Ran off with him. He's harboring her, interfering with legal labor." Sheriff Dunley scratched at his beard and eyed the paper. "You sold her," he said slowly. "I made a trade. That don't cancel the contract. She belongs to the railroad." Dunley leaned back in his chair, boots crossing on the desk. "Well, I ain't riding up there," he said. "Ain't paid enough to get shot over a woman who don't want to be where you put her. Mountain Man's got his ways. Always did." Bledsoe's face darkened. "You'll do nothing? She ain't caused trouble. He's never come down with blood on his hands. Far as I'm concerned, it's not my business." Bledsoe stared at him, jaw twitching. "Then I'll make it my business." He left the office, stormed down Main Street, and found what he needed: men with empty pockets and bitter hearts. A pair of drifters just off a failed gold strike, a railroad guard with too many debts, a farmer's son with a new rifle and no sense. He paid them in silver and liquor, waving the contract like a flag of righteousness. 5 years she owes me," he barked, "and he thinks he can hide her in the pines like a secret? No, sir, that mountain don't belong to him. We ride at first light." The saloon doors swung closed behind him. Inside, an old man near the fire shook his head. "He'll regret that," he muttered to no one. "You don't go stirring ghosts on that ridge. Not unless you want one to follow you back." But Bledsoe didn't believe in ghosts, only ownership, only payment. And in his mind, Mei Lin was still something owed. The sun was just beginning to rise, spilling pale light over the ridge, when the sound of hooves broke the morning calm. Elijah stood at the edge of the clearing, axe in hand, halfway through splitting a thick round of pine. He turned his head slightly, already knowing the rhythm of the gait. No stranger rode like that. Not up this far, not without a reason. The horse crested the hill slowly, its rider wrapped in a shawl the color of chimney smoke. Miss Tilda reined in and dismounted with a grunt. She was in her 60s, spine straight as a board, hands worn from decades of delivering life into this hard world. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked straight to the porch and planted herself like she'd been growing there all along. "Elijah Stone," she said, removing her gloves one finger at a time. "I reckon you already know why I'm here." Elijah said nothing, only set the axe down and motioned for her to follow him inside. The cabin was quiet. Mei Lin stood by the hearth, hands dusted with flour, her braid falling over one shoulder. She looked at the midwife with eyes wide but not frightened. Not anymore. Miss Tilda looked her up and down, not with judgment, but with the gaze of someone who'd seen too many bruised women, too many silent mouths. Mei Lin offered a polite nod. The midwife returned it with a small, tight smile. "She's got good eyes," Tilda murmured once Mei Lin stepped outside to fetch water. "Soft, but not weak." Elijah poured her tea and said nothing. "You love her?" she asked plainly. His hands stilled. The tea steamed between them. "I didn't say anything about want or need, Elijah. I asked if you love her." He stared into the cup like it held a map he didn't know how to read. "She sings in the mornings," he said at last. "Even when it's cold, she sings." Miss Tilda nodded. "And does she know what's coming?" Elijah's jaw flexed. "No." "Well, she should." She leaned in then, voice low. Firm. "Bledsoe's coming. He's got a paper that claims she owes him years of labor. Railroad contract, stamped and signed. It won't hold in a real court, but out here, Folks don't wait for judges. He's bringing men, rifles, says she's property, and you're a thief. Elijah's eyes flickered toward the door. Mei Lin was kneeling by the garden plot, straightening the row markers, humming something soft. She deserves more than this, Tilda said gently, more than hiding in pine and snow, waiting for the next man to take her. She's not a secret. She's not a wound to be buried. Elijah sat heavily in his chair. I brought her here to be safe, he muttered. Safe's not the same as free, Tilda said, and you know it. They sat in silence for a long while. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind stirred the trees. Finally, Elijah stood, walked to the doorway, and watched Mei Lin tend the garden. She looked up and smiled, not big, not bold, but enough to split his heart down the middle. He looked out over the valley, where the smoke from town always rose in the far distance. He had built a fortress from pain, but now he faced a question he could no longer dodge. Was he ready to fight for her future, or just guard her past? The morning after Miss Tilda rode back to town, the air changed. It wasn't the weather, though clouds did crowd the horizon. It was something deeper, a tension in the soil, in the silence, in the way Elijah watched the ridgeline too long, too often. He didn't say anything to Mei Lin at first, but she saw it in his hands, how they moved sharper, more urgent. He spent hours at the shed, checking traps, sharpening blades, oiling the rifle until the metal gleamed like a mirror. Mei Lin noticed the shift, and though he tried to shield her from it, she wasn't blind. She saw the way he studied every sound outside the cabin, the way he sat at night with his back to the door instead of the fire, and she knew, deep in her bones, that someone was coming. She didn't wait to be told. She began to pack. Quietly, she folded clothes, dried herbs, wrapped her mother's tea pouch in linen. She dug up half the garden and placed the seedlings in wet cloth, planning to carry them wrapped in her shawl. Her hands moved fast, but her heart was heavy. When Elijah walked in and saw her gathering supplies into a satchel, he stopped cold. "What are you doing?" he asked, voice low. "I won't let you die for me," she said without turning. "You've already lost too much." He stepped forward, slow and steady. "I ain't running," he said. "I am," she replied. "They want me. Not you." He put a hand on the satchel and gently pulled it away from her. "They come for you. They come through me," he said. "Ain't nobody taking you down this mountain unless I'm dead. And I ain't planning on dying." Her lip trembled. "But why?" He looked at her for a long time, then said, "Because this is our land now. Ours. Ain't no man buying you again." That afternoon, he handed her the shotgun. She stared at it like it was a snake, then took it with trembling fingers. "You ever fire one?" he asked. She shook her head. "Good. Let's change that." They went out to a stump behind the cabin where Elijah had carved a target into the bark of a pine. He showed her how to hold it, how to breathe, how to let the shot break like thunder, not fear. Her first try nearly knocked her backward, but he caught her. "Again," he said. By sundown, her shoulder was sore and her aim was straight. Inside, Elijah boarded the windows, reinforced the door, placed a second rifle above the mantel. Mei Lin brewed tea that night with shaking hands, not jasmine but ginger, to steady herself. She placed a cup beside his chair. He didn't say thank you, but he drank it slow. They didn't speak much. There wasn't need. The cabin had changed. It wasn't just shelter now. It was a line drawn in the snow. As night fell, Elijah cleaned his knife, eyes scanning the darkness. Mei Lin sat close to the fire, fingers wrapped around the carved rabbit on the shelf. They were no longer just surviving. They were preparing to fight. The snow came early that morning, thin and sharp like ground glass falling from the sky. It coated the earth in a fresh white sheet, clean and cruel. Elijah stood at the window, watching the treetops sway. The wind carried a different kind of silence now, not peaceful, but waiting, the kind of stillness that settles right before the storm breaks. He heard them before he saw them, hooves crunching snow, boots displacing brush, voices low and mean like wolves growling in the dark. Mei Lin was kneeling by the hearth, loading the last shells into the shotgun with hands that didn't tremble. She had braided her hair tight. She had no intention of running. The first shot rang out just as the sun slipped behind the ridge. A bullet shattered the top window pane, scattering shards across the floor. Elijah didn't flinch. He grabbed his rifle from the wall and dropped to one knee, pressing his back against the doorframe. "Stay low," he said. Mei Lin was already moving, crawling toward the root cellar door, shotgun hugged tight to her chest. Bledsoe's voice came next, loud and cruel. "Elijah Stone, you're harboring a fugitive under contract. Bring her out, and we'll spare the house." Elijah didn't answer. Instead, he fired. The report cracked through the forest. A scream followed, one of Bledsoe's hired guns stumbling behind a tree, clutching his arm. The others spread out, torches lighting the tree line like glowing eyes. Fire danced on the snow. Boots pounded. Shadows darted between trunks. The cabin groaned as more shots came, bullets punching into the logs, spitting splinters into the room. Elijah moved like he was part of the wood itself, calm, solid, his eyes cold. He fired again. One man dropped. Another returned fire. Elijah ducked, but not fast enough. The bullet caught him in the shoulder. He grunted, staggered back, blood soaking through his coat. Mei Lin cried out, crawling to him, but he waved her off with his good arm. "Stick to the plan," he rasped. She nodded, her jaw set like stone. Then she disappeared through the back hatch and into the trees. Bledsoe shouted something else, vulgar, triumphant. He moved in with two of his men, rifles raised, faces smug. But they didn't see her. Mei Lin emerged from behind the tool shed, hidden by the snow-heavy brush, shotgun braced against her shoulder. She waited until the lead man was within 10 paces. Then she fired. The blast was deafening. One of Bledsoe's men dropped hard into the snow, legs twitching. The others spun, confused. Elijah used the distraction to fire again, despite the blood running down his arm. Another scream echoed through the trees. "Fall back!" someone shouted. "It's a trap!" Then, from the ridge trail, another sound rose, the unmistakable rhythm of horses, dozens of hooves, voices calling. The townsfolk had come. Led by Miss Tilda on her old gray mare, they rode in like a wave of judgment. The blacksmith, the baker's son, even the sheriff, red-faced and huffing, rifle in hand. Bledsoe froze, caught between fire and fury. Miss Tilda pointed her shotgun right at him. "You brought lawless men into our woods, fired into a home, and tried to drag off a woman like she was livestock," she said. "You'll answer for this." Bledsoe backed away slowly, hands raised, his face twitching with rage and disbelief. "She was mine," he spat. "She was never yours," Tilda said. "Not then, not now." He dropped his gun into the snow. Behind her, the townsfolk formed a wall of silence and iron. And just like that, Bledsoe's war ended. Not with a bang, but with a reckoning. The cold held steady even after the shooting stopped. Smoke from spent gunpowder drifted into the trees, mingling with the steam rising from breath and sweat. Elijah leaned against the doorframe of the cabin, blood darkening the cloth pressed to his shoulder, his face pale but proud. Mei Lin knelt beside him, steady as stone, the shotgun still within reach, her fingers stained with soot and snow. Miss Tilda dismounted slowly, her gray mare snorting in the silence. Her boots crunched across the frozen ground as she walked past Bledsoe, who stood surrounded now by men and women who'd once crossed the street to avoid Elijah, who'd once whispered cruel things about Mei Lin. But they'd come, and now they stood still, waiting for the truth to be spoken. Tilda didn't speak at first. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a worn, leather-bound ledger, the edges curled, the pages weathered but intact. She held it high so everyone could see. The sheriff, red-faced and cornered, shifted uncomfortably beside her. "Found this," Tilda said, her voice clear and firm. "Tucked under Bledsoe's saddle blanket. Thought maybe it was just rail schedules or shipping logs. But it ain't." She flipped it open, thumbed through the pages. Her finger landed on one, tapped it once. "Names," she said. "Dozens of them. Chinese girls, ages, sale prices, dates, destinations. Half of them never showed up again. One name, Lu Xianmei, marked as deceased during transport. Contract terminated. No investigation." She turned another page. Payments listed from mine bosses. Signatures forged. Some from men who've been dead 5 years. Others never worked with the railroad a day in their life. Bledsoe's face turned gray. His jaw twitched, but no words came. The townsfolk began murmuring. Men who once drank with Bledsoe now looked at him like they didn't know him. Women clutched their shawls tighter. Miss Tilda didn't stop. This man wasn't a foreman. He was a trafficker, a slaver with a fancy title. Bought women, sold them, beat them, buried the ones who didn't last. And he was about to do it again. She snapped the ledger shut. The sheriff stepped forward, finally finding his voice. "You're sure it's enough?" Tilda handed him the ledger. "You tell me." The sheriff opened it, scanned the pages, and cursed under his breath. "It's enough." He turned to Bledsoe, pulling a set of iron cuffs from his belt. For a moment he hesitated, perhaps out of shame that he hadn't acted sooner, hadn't asked more questions. Then he stepped forward and clapped them onto Bledsoe's wrists. "You're under arrest," he said, "for human trafficking, fraud, forgery, and attempted kidnapping." Bledsoe didn't fight. He just lowered his head and stared at the snow like it might swallow him whole. The sheriff turned to Elijah. "You want to press charges for the shooting?" Elijah shook his head once. "No, he'll face worse down there." Miss Tilda nodded. "Justice is catching up. Finally." As the sheriff led Bledsoe down the trail, the townsfolk parted, silent. Some followed behind, others stayed behind to help. A few approached the cabin, offering quiet nods, a blanket, a jar of honey, a hand on the shoulder. And inside, Elijah and Mei Lin sat together by the fire, the worst of the storm behind them. For the first time in a long time, the mountain felt clean. The courtroom in Bitterroot Crossing wasn't much, just the back half of the town hall, with benches that creaked under weight and windows that let in too much dust. But on the day of the trial, it was packed tighter than the saloon on payday. Every seat filled, every corner taken. Folks who hadn't set foot in that room in years came early, whispering and staring, eyes flicking to the front where the man in shackles sat with his head low and lips pressed tight. Bledsoe looked smaller than he had on the mountain, less like a foreman, more like a man caught in his own lies. Judge Winfield, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, called the room to order with a single bang of his gavel. The room hushed, though the tension remained, a thread stretched from wall to wall, waiting to snap. Elijah was called first. He stood slowly, his arms still in a sling, his face worn from healing and sleepless nights. As he made his way to the stand, heads turned and whispers stirred. The town had always spoken about Elijah Stone with fear, with pity, with wonder. Now they saw him not as a ghost, but as a man who had taken in a stranger and risked his life to protect her. He told the truth, plain and slow, about the day he saw Mei Lin on the auction block, about the gold he paid, about the days in the cabin, the traps, the tea, the garden growing under snow. His voice cracked once when he spoke her name, but he never stopped. Not when he described the night the guns came, not when he showed the bullet scar on his shoulder. When he was done, there was silence. No applause, no shouts, just breath held and released, like the room itself had been waiting to exhale. Mei Lin was next. She stood in a dress Miss Tilda had helped mend, hair pulled back, hands folded tight. She looked out over the faces, some curious, some kind, some unsure. But she did not flinch. Her English came slow and careful, each word chosen like a stepping stone across a deep river. He said, "I was contract," she began, "but I never signed, never agreed. My mother died on the ship. They sold me." Her voice quivered, but she stood straighter. "Elijah never touched me, never hurt. He give me fire and land and space to be human." Some in the room lowered their eyes. Others nodded, solemn. Then Miss Tilda approached the front, her boots echoing like thunder in a dry canyon. She placed the ledger on the judge's bench and opened it to the marked pages. "This," she said, "is not just ink and paper. It's proof. Every name in here is a life he tried to break." The judge read for a long time, flipping page after page, jaw tightening with each turn. Then he looked at Bledsoe. "You've trafficked human beings, falsified documents, abused authority, and endangered innocent lives. This court finds you guilty on all counts." The gavel fell. Sentenced to 20 years hard labor in federal custody. The room erupted, not in chaos, but in something close to joy. Cheers rose from the back. Someone clapped. A woman wept softly. The sheriff placed a firm hand on Bledsoe's shoulder and led him away, chains dragging across the floor like a broken promise. Elijah sat back beside Mei Lin. She reached for his hand beneath the bench, and this time, he didn't hesitate. Outside, the bells of the chapel rang once. Justice had come to Bitterroot Crossing. And for the first time in years, the town stood a little straighter. The wind was softer when they returned to the mountain. The snow had receded into the gullies, and the pines stood tall and green, their needles rustling like quiet applause. The cabin came into view as they crested the ridge, sunlight warming the roof where the smoke rose steady from the chimney. It looked the same, but everything had changed. Elijah carried the last of their supplies up the steps, slower now, his shoulder stiff beneath the healing wound. Mei Lin followed behind, silent but not withdrawn, her eyes taking in the trees, the garden bed, the place that had become something more than shelter. She moved like someone who belonged. That night, after the fire was built and the tea had steeped, Elijah sat by the window with his hands folded and gaze fixed outward, as if he could see something waiting far beyond the trees. Mei Lin sat across from him, watching the lines in his face deepen as silence stretched between them. He finally spoke. "You don't have to stay," he said quietly. "The town's open to you now. They'd help you. Miss Tilda, the church women. You'd have a place." Mei Lin didn't answer right away. She looked at her hands, at the lines of her palms, then at the firelight dancing on the wooden floor. When she rose, Elijah didn't move. He waited, braced for the moment he would have to let go. But instead of walking toward the door, Mei Lin stepped to the shelf above the hearth. Her fingers closed around something small and familiar. She returned to him and knelt gently before his chair. She placed the carved wooden rabbit in his lap, the very one he had left for her months ago, when she was still silent and afraid, still unsure whether he was mercy or danger. Now she laid it down, not with fear, but with certainty. "I am free," she said softly. "You gave me that." Her voice trembled, but only with feeling. "Now I choose to stay." Elijah looked down at the rabbit, then at her. His breath caught in his throat, not from surprise, but from something older, hope, once buried, now blooming in slow and sacred silence. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small ring. It wasn't polished or new. It was simple, a circle of silver, beaten smooth by his own hand. He had carved it in secret, with the same care he'd used on the rabbit, the same reverence he gave to the land and to her presence in his life. He knelt beside her, slowly, one knee creaking against the wooden floor. He took her hand, calloused and warm, and slid the ring onto her finger. No fanfare, no speeches, just two people kneeling in firelight, bound by choice and healing, and something deeper than either could name. Outside, the trees stood still. The mountain held its breath. Inside, a new life had begun, not out of rescue, but of choosing. And love, quiet and unwavering, settled between them like the first snow of spring. The mountain had never seen a summer like this. The cold was gone from the ground, and where once snow had pressed hard against the earth, rows of green now unfurled in quiet triumph. Mei Lin's garden had grown beyond the patch she first claimed in early spring. Now it spread like a quilt down the slope, bursting with long squash, climbing beans, chives, and bright red radishes that peeked from the soil like shy children. Bees danced from blossom to blossom. The wind, once sharp and biting, now carried the soft hum of life and the scent of fresh herbs. Each morning, Mei Lin rose with the sun. She wore her straw hat low and her sleeves rolled to the elbow. She worked the soil with hands no longer timid, her steps sure, her movements steady. Elijah built benches beside the garden, smooth, wide-planked seats made from fallen pine, and set them facing the rows so visitors could sit and breathe it all in. He carved flowers into the backs of the wood, and when Mei Lin saw them, she touched one gently and smiled. Then came the children. They arrived in ones and twos at first, sent by mothers who had once whispered fear behind closed doors. Curiosity had taken root in the town, grown by the stories of Mei Lin's bravery and Elijah's stand. Miss Tilda brought the first boy, a shy thing with a stutter and a love for drawing. Then came a girl who knew her letters, but not how to write them. Then twins, curious and rowdy, who tumbled down the trail with sticks pretending to be swords. Mei Lin welcomed each child with calm and grace. She cleared space under the old oak beside the cabin and laid down mats and blankets. She wrote English words on slate boards with clean, careful strokes. Then Chinese characters beside them. She spoke slowly, clearly, her voice patient. The children listened, wide-eyed and eager. They didn't understand everything she said, but they understood her warmth. Elijah stayed nearby, not intruding, but watching. He built a second bench under the oak, then a third. He fashioned a wooden box to store chalk and slates. He fixed a broken boot for one boy and showed another how to carve a whistle from bark. The laughter that once startled him now came as a comfort, like birdsong at dawn. Neighbors came too. A woman from town brought loaves of honey bread wrapped in cloth. A blacksmith dropped off a new spade with a quiet nod. An older man, once loud in his disapproval, came bearing seeds for sugar peas, muttering something about wasting good dirt if it ain't used. They no longer called Mei Lin that foreign girl. They called her Miss May. They didn't look at Elijah with suspicion. They looked at him with respect. At sunset, when the children had gone and the garden slept in golden light, Elijah and Mei Lin would sit on the bench closest to the cabin. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they didn't need to. The wind would move through the tall grass, and the sound of peace, earned and rooted, would settle around them. And so, the garden grew, not just from the soil, but from what had been planted in hearts, trust, redemption, and something that looked very much like love shared freely. The seasons turned again, soft as breath. Summer had faded into the bronze hush of fall, and then winter returned, not with cruelty this time, but with quiet purpose. Snow touched the garden beds now at rest, blanketing the soil that had once brimmed with green. The trees stood bare and still, but the cabin remained warm, glowing through the long nights like a lantern cupped in gentle hands. Inside there was life. The fire cracked steadily in the hearth, and from the small back room came a sound that had never graced those walls before. Laughter, light and high, as pure as wind chimes dancing in spring. The laughter of a child. Mei Lin stepped from the bedroom, swaddled in a thick robe, her arms cradling a tiny girl wrapped in quilted flannel. The child blinked up at the light, wide-eyed, her fingers curling and uncurling like petals unfurling to sun. A tuft of dark hair peeked from beneath the cap. Her cheeks were round and pink, her giggle bright enough to chase shadows from corners. Mei Lin kissed her brow and walked softly across the room. Elijah sat at the work table near the window, head bent, carving knife in hand. A block of soft wood rested beneath his fingers, slowly taking the shape of a horse. Around him, small toys lay in neat rows, animals, dolls, puzzles, each one shaped with care, smoothed with oil, sanded down until they felt like silk in the hand. He looked up as Mei Lin approached, and his face, once furrowed with pain, once carved in solitude, broke into a slow, weathered smile. Not the guarded kind he used to wear, not the half-smile that passed for approval. This one was full, earnest, the kind of smile that knew sorrow and had chosen joy anyway. Mei Lin placed the baby in his arms. He took her without fear now, holding her close, his large hands wrapping around her like the mountains themselves had bent low to keep her safe. She smiled in her sleep again, Mei Lin whispered, brushing the baby's cheek. Like she knows something. Elijah nodded, his voice thick but sure. She knows she's loved. They had named her Lily. It was Mei Lin who had spoken the name first, gently by the fire one evening. Elijah had been silent for a long time after that. Then he stood, walked out into the snow, and returned with a wooden box wrapped in oilskin. Inside had been the old drawing, the shawl, and the tiny shoes. They buried them beneath the largest tree near the garden, wrapped in linen, roots curling around the memory of the first lily, making room for the second. Now, as Elijah rocked the new lily gently in his arms, he hummed under his breath, a tune Mei Lin had once sung while planting squash. The baby cooed, eyes fluttering, a cradle beside the fire, handmade and smoothed by years of skill and longing, rocked slowly in rhythm with her breath. Outside, snow fell in soft silence, but within the walls of the cabin, life stirred, life healed. A man who once believed himself finished now carved futures with steady hands. A woman who had once been sold now held a crown of laughter in her arms. And in the flicker of firelight, love continued its quiet work. The years rolled on, quiet as snowfall, and the mountain kept its rhythm, seasons turning like pages, each one marked by the steady pulse of life in a cabin above the clouds. The garden grew broader with every spring, its rows expanding like laughter across the slope. Where once only silence had lived, now came voices, small feet pounding through the grass, laughter echoing down the hill, the clatter of tools, the hush of evening songs sung by a mother with a voice like warm tea. Travelers began to speak of them. At first it was only traders who told the tale, men passing through Bitterroot Crossing who swore they'd been caught in a snowstorm and found shelter in a cabin where the fire never died and the stew never ran out. They spoke of a man built like a mountain, with a silver beard and hands thick with work, and a woman with dark eyes and a calm that settled into your bones like peace itself. The stories trickled into the town like river water, slow, sure, impossible to stop. Then came those seeking more than shelter. A widow with nothing but her children and a letter. A broken soldier who couldn't walk through doorways without flinching. A runaway girl with bruises hidden under her dress and no name she dared speak. They were all taken in, fed, given rest, shown kindness without question. Some stayed for a day, others for months. All left changed. The townsfolk watched. They remembered the man they used to fear, the recluse with a rifle and a scar, and they saw now a father, a builder, a teacher. They remembered the foreign girl who once stood on the auction block like an object for trade, and they saw now a woman of grace and grit who could teach your child to read, mend your wound with herbs, and look you in the eye without lowering her own. Children who visited the mountain came back speaking both English and Chinese, carrying carved animals in their pockets and stories of a cradle by the fire and a baby named Lily, who now ran through the woods like a doe, her laughter bright and wild. They called her Miss May, in town still, but with reverence now. Some called Elijah Mr. Stone, though most just called him the Mountain, but others, the older ones, the ones who remembered the fire and the silence that came after, whispered it different. They said she came in chains. They said he spoke only to claim her. They said she took his hand not out of fear, but because she saw something no one else could. And when they sat together in church one Sunday each spring, quiet in the back pew, her hand folded over his, they didn't need to say anything. People just watched and nodded. He never smiled before her, they'd say. Never lived. She gave him back his soul. And still, after all the years, when someone new rode through Bitterroot and asked about the cabin in the pines, someone would lean in close and say, "That's where she lives now, the Chinese woman they tried to sell. She's not a servant, not a ghost. She's the queen of that mountain." Then they'd pause, smile, and finish the tale. She called him husband, and he became one.